Okay, we are live on the Tom Nelson podcast. We have Ben Pyle here from Climate Resistance.
Sure.
And Ben, could you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Tom. Great to meet at last. We've been talking for many years. Well, we've been sharing tweets and so on for
Yeah.
years. One interesting question I think is always, when did you become a climate skeptic?
Yes.
And because I was listening you've written about it as well. And I heard you discussing it with Chris Horner, that yours was this sort of entanglement with an orthodoxy that was birds. Is that right?
Every-billed woodpecker. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. And then so as a layperson myself, although I think you had a background in that, but you emphasize citizen science, and that
Yes.
was what really, I sort of became vaguely climate skeptic after having been quite green and quite left
Okay.
in around about 20 years ago. And the moment up until that point, I'd been really, really quite committed to the green side. And then Mark Lynas, who was a local activist at the time, he's quite famous now, chucked a custard pie
Oh, yeah.
into Bjorn Lomborg's face at a book reading at a bookshop
Yeah.
up in Oxford where I lived. And I just thought, well, that's just weird, isn't it? Like that's not how we do things. And the local Greens had campaigned to get him banned from university property, so he wouldn't be able to give an informal talk to academics. And it's not like Oxford is some, minor league university where there's no, I mean, any university, no university should ban people from its premises and ban debate. But Oxford's supposed to be the home of, one of the oldest universities in the world, the home of independent thought, one would think. And I thought, well, this is really odd. And so I bought the book, more for Mark Lynas and co, because I mean they were very pleased with themselves. But it cemented for me that there was another argument to be had. So after a few years of that sort of brewing in my head, I thought that there was a broader gap than the one Bjorn Lomborg had identified in the debate. So I started this blog with a co-writer, Stuart, and we thought that we were sort of more interrogating the political dimensions, the ideological dimensions of the climate debate. Like what kind of worlds do environmentalists either consciously or implicitly want to create? What will it look like when we have our green utopia, and what are the? I've still got most of on my about page at Climate Resistance, the blog, which is most of the blog has undergone several revisions, but actually the main points that we were starting at were quite have remained quite solid, and that was that we didn't really think the foundation of the green movement, the claim in science was all that strong for alarmism. It might be that there's climate change, it might be there's global warming it's causing climate change, and CO2 causes all that.
Yeah.
But that's a long way away from what they want us to do, which is a radical transformation of society. Now, at the time and since, it's quite remarkable to me that there's been political movements like the social justice movement, wasn't it, that became the woke plot, and they were interrogating even paintings and historical institutions and people's families for past historical transgressions and past moral transgressions, but they didn't. It was always amazing to me that this kind of level of scrutiny was never applied to the green movement. Now, if you want to find a repugnant history before and during and since the Second World War, you'll find nothing more repugnant than and the environmental movement. I mean, literally an attempt to put white European man at the center of a cosmological and ecological order. I mean, it's that blunt, but that didn't yield any criticism from the so-called social sciences and humanities that were sort of were doing all this revision. Which is not to say we should synthesize that. There's not that we should do what the woke and the SJW movements did, but that there is a very real neo-colonial aspect to contemporary environmentalism. It's a real problematic, as the SJWs used to say. So, you know, there's racism in the climate agenda. It says that we have what the benefits of industrialization that we have received are not going to be well, the developing world can't have that. They make the claim that well, the developing world can leapfrog
Yes. Yeah.
what we've had, but that doesn't get produced. I mean, China's ascendancy, its economic success over the last 20 years has been powered in large part by burning coal. So, you know, and then so when you get global institutions that really need a much more scrutiny, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, organizing to prevent finance going to fossil fuel projects, hydrocarbon projects in the developing world.
Yeah, I think that's hugely evil. I think that part of it is just it's tremendously evil to so that the hospitals in Africa, for example, don't get reliable power. I think that is a great example of the road to hell is paved with allegedly good intentions, but it's a terribly evil thing.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it would be these interventions just would not be tolerated in the West. I mean, the extent to which we do tolerate it, it's sort of got to be is being tested and challenged, I think, in the near future. But
Yes. Yeah.
you know, as it's come to a crunch, but you know, we wouldn't accept intermittent power of that kind. We wouldn't accept such a reduction in the level of service. And we were asking questions like, well, what are Greenpeace and erstwhile one-time development agencies like Oxfam, what are they doing trying to prevent the development of fossil fuels as part of the development agenda? It seems to me that an organization like Oxfam's interventions in this domain were completely antithetical to its founding. But I'm saying the green movement had sort of spread out beyond the sort of narrow bunch of NGOs and so on. So we were writing on a range of subjects on the blog that was sort of dealing with, on the one hand, the sort of some of the scientific claims, but trying to take it all the way through to the politics and the policy as well. We weren't trying to sort of say don't do science, but that actually there are many, maybe we'll come on to this later, but there are many different points along the chain of reasoning that Greens have, from the claim that CO2 is a greenhouse gas through to we must close down the power stations. There are lots of different points of possible intervention that people can make, and we shouldn't be focused on the first order claims that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, that this produces global warming, this produces climate change, and so on. So after we a few years of doing that, I worked for Godfrey Bloom, a UKIP MEP in the European Parliament, as a researcher for a while. That was good fun. He was very sympathetic to the well, he's probably been skeptical of the agenda for longer than I had, and so yeah, he was he gave me a pretty broad brief to sort of do what I want, but also to supply him with sort of the facts and analyses and information that he would use in his arguments. And also Roger Helmer, another MEP. So Godfrey left the party in a sign of controversy in about 2013. So I carried on for working with them for another year. And I've been writing a lot for Spiked along, which is more a sort of condensed. The articles I've been writing for Spiked are sort of more condensed versions of what's been on the blog. So it's about 100 articles on the Spiked Online website, and I've written that the sort of attempts to sort of frame these things more narrowly and put them in the context of the contemporary stories. So there's a lot on net zero. There's a lot on air pollution and so on. And then more recently, I've been trying to make films, which is very labor intensive, time consuming. But there's I've got a half a dozen or so shows on YouTube, which is much more exciting than I think than blogging. I mean, it was much more. You might get a few hundred people visit your blog, maybe a couple of thousand for a good piece, but YouTube sort of seems to broaden it out, and or Rumble, I should say. There are other less interventionist platforms available that don't try to control content.
Yeah. So we were mentioning that you are getting rave reviews for one of your recent videos on YouTube, right? I think it's maybe 24 minutes long. I watched it myself. I think it's fantastic stuff. I give you kudos for doing that. I think it's very effective pushback. I like it. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Yeah, that was the intended consequences video.
Yeah. Yes.
So this was something. I mean, it was good for. I mean, we were trying to do this back in the day. We were trying to do this sort of. Some would say quite philosophical, quite woolly, like kind of, humanities, social sciences type. Sometimes not very concrete and sort of, it's not like material science where you can say, A plus B equals C. It's more discursive and what have you. And it was Godfrey was saying, follow the money, follow the money. Follow the money, and I was like, oh, how far can you get following the money? Well, it turns out that the environmental movement, which I mean, I call it a movement. It's not really a movement. It's more of a performance art. True. I mean, there's a constellation of green organizations that intervene in national and global politics. From the obvious ones like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth to these quite small but mysteriously high profile organizations that are essentially just a blog, and it turns out they get quite a lot of money. So the entire I made a point, maybe Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth notwithstanding, the rest of them, the green movement pretty much would not exist without the benevolence of about half a dozen, maybe a dozen philanthropic foundations, and it's just an enormous amount of money. So the Greens are very keen on claiming that we, i.e. independent people like you and I, who get no money from doing this whatsoever, are funded by big oil. And then it turns out actually, there are figures like, Jeff Bezos has just given 10 billion in funding to green organizations. That's a pretty huge amount of money. And then Mike Bloomberg in his history has spent 11 billion on philanthropy. We've got much smaller billionaires here in the UK. Our biggest green donor is Sir Christopher Hone. And he's spending in the order, I think in 2020, it was $180 million on green campaigning organizations. And then there's a sort of a pass-through fund, as it were, in Britain and Europe, called the European Climate Foundation, which has a little bit more money. And that includes, if you try and look at the donors, some of their information, most of their Most of their information is opaque. You can't find out who funds, sorry, where their money goes. And we know that million euros, 30 million,
Yep.
is from anonymous donations. So, and this sort of speaks to their claim that the Greens claim. You know, the ECF funds organizations that go around lobbying for transparency, using a very significant portion of their money, which is completely unaccountable. It's quite remarkable. So one of those setups, or actually a couple of those setups, they use the example of Spiked, which I've written of, and written for, sorry, and they use I read a review of Roger Pielke's book about climate disasters, and you know, he points out, and he's no skeptic. I mean, he's skeptical. He's critical of policy, but he's not a climate change skeptic. He's not against the IPCC. But they use an image of my article in their sort of like Spiked is this Koch brothers funded big oil defending organization. Now I don't know what Spiked's financial arrangements are, but I know it's shoestring, right? And I know and the Koch brothers thing, for example, the Koch brothers philanthropic fund funded their free speech tour of American campuses. They didn't fund the news side of things. So, but let's assume that they are operating on about £150,000 a year, or let's say euros. That 30 million anonymous donations that come to the ECF in just 1 year is enough to keep Spiked going for 2 centuries. And yet this is what drives Monbiot and The Guardian mad. And if you look at The Guardian and you dig down, they admit that they're funded by these billionaires. Actually, they ran an advert campaign on Twitter that said, we are supported by our readers, not by billionaires. And it's just not true. I mean, there's a page of like kind of, and it says the European Climate Foundation supports our environmental journalism, and it supports our, you know, so they're taking millions of pounds from these millionaires while pointing out that someone else may or may not have received a couple of thousand from a philanthropic campaign. So it's a very, I think it's possible to say civil society as it was conceived of in the West depended on philanthropy. But we've reached the point at which now philanthropy has just bought pretty much all of civil society, and it owns it. And so the value of civil society is lost. It's just a lobbying organization. Because all of the civil society organizations that intervened have been aligned to the right side of the climate debate. So they you know, but it gets hidden as it looks like charity to the normal, to a face value view of things. So yeah, in the video, I was looking at one aspect of what the likes of Christopher Hone and Mike Bloomberg were funding, which is the ESG movement, or particularly the E in the ESG movement. And turns out there's a constellation of organizations that pretty much just controlled by Christopher Hone, that have pushed to lobby shareholders. That might be you or I, in our pension funds, or it might be a larger concern, like maybe in the public sector here, the people who own the pension fund, the people who have, interest in the pension fund, operate the pension fund, at least at some level, right? So you get to make the choices about where all the money goes. So they would lobby, like a pension fund operated by the fire brigade union or teachers or something. They would lobby the management of these kind of things. So you've got to divest from fossil fuels. You've got to divest. You've got to go and buy ESG stock, and of course, ESG stock is stuff like it's vapor, stuff like Netflix. So people pull their money out of fossil fuels, and they lobby banks if they may have they've got a few shares in Barclays. They may sort of press to change the policy at the board level, often using quite coercive tactics to say you must stop financing, you must stop lending money to fossil fuel companies. So this has increased the cost of capital for hydrocarbons quite significantly. And then that
I have a question here. You said Netflix is an example of an ESG company. That's a bad weather preventing company.
ESG is so Netflix is just. I mean, it's just I just use it as an example of a company that doesn't. It's just vapor. It's like, I mean, it's got a value. I'm not denying as a service or a value, but that in the round, if you're gonna take the view that this sort of model of ownership of production, we're not Marxists, right? We believe that the market should, but so that they've made this they've made an intervention. This big capital has made an intervention, a political intervention.
Yes.
That is restricting the capital available to fossil fuels. So it's sort of like so it may not have come from government, but it has. Well, I'll get onto that. But
okay.
It's increased the cost of capital is the main point. So you said anyone with money should not put their money into hydrocarbons, and we see that the result is that there's been no investment, and that's why we've had the supply crisis. So we can find that billionaires have been working deliberately, explicitly towards putting a boot on the neck of the global supply of hydrocarbon energy.
Okay.
So that has created the supply crisis. That's created the price crisis.
Yes.
Because so a lot of people were laid off. A lot of infrastructure was closed down during the pandemic. So when the recovery came, a decade of underinvestment and a couple of years of reduced demand suddenly came together in this sort of this obnoxious, perfect storm, I guess. And so a lot of agencies that sort of should be alive to the possibility of that sort of thing were in fact instrumental in creating it. So I point out the Bank of England under the one before last of the UK government, which just we have so many of them these days.
Okay.
The Chancellor George Osborne appointed Mark Carney, who had been the governor of the Bank of Canada to the Bank of England. I don't know what in his CV made him a good candidate, but anyway, the Bank of England is a somewhat autonomous agency of the UK, and basically Mark Carney turned it into a green NGO. And he variously sort of, I mean, he's big pals with Mike Bloomberg. So he appointed Bloomberg to a sort of an advisory organization that would set the ESG standards. So for disclosure of environmental climate risks. So if your company uses a lot of oil, you have to disclose this to your shareholders under this sort of regulatory idea, and you have to explain how you're going to reduce your emissions and so on and so forth under the E of ESG.
Okay.
So this was the Bank of England was pushing for this stuff. And so, and the Bank of England has its main job. Its main job is to control inflation. So the Bank of England knew that it was restricting the supply of oil. It knew that it was printing money while it was restricting the supply of oil and gas. and it knew that both of these things create inflationary pressure. And I find it inconceivable that anyone
Mm,
involved with the Bank of England doesn't know those two things
right.
as orthodoxy. So I say there's an element to which what we're experiencing now was an intended
Yeah.
consequence
Yeah.
of the green billionaires, of regulatory agencies, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so I probably say it more succinctly in the film, actually, but there it is in a nutshell.
Okay. So
It was
speaking of choking off the power supply, I saw something about how they didn't just close down the power plants, but they blew up parts of them, maybe blew up the towers. Do you know anything about that? Where instead of just closing them down, where they could be started up, they've closed them down and kind of
yeah.
so we can't start them up again. I think that is a terrible idea.
Yeah, so since
Yeah.
2012, um, the UK has, and thanks to domestic UK policy and EU policy, the UK has blown up about 27 gigawatts of capacity of oil and mainly coal fired power stations, right? So
Yeah.
that's quite a lot in British terms. It's not hella beans in America, but it is here. It would have solved all of our problems if we hadn't blown them up. But there is a they knew there was a risk that if things went wrong, the coal plants would just be brought back online. And the haste with which some of them were blown up was quite breathtaking. Like normally, that would be a process that took years to sort of to close and demolish a power station. I mean, I grew up near one in Oxford. I used to be able to see the power station on my walk home from school, because my school was at
Oh,
the top of the
okay.
hill, and I used to walk down one. You could see in the distance, about 12 miles away, there's a power station. You can see the stacks and the cooling towers, and the vapor. And that was just gone within a year or so. And I'm like, wow, this it was almost seemed spiteful,
Yeah.
the relish. But I think the sort of the main thing that you're referring to there was the closure of Ferrybridge. Actually, Ferrybridge did close down a bit longer ago, but last summer, the UK's president of COP26, who's an MP, who was a minister, Alok Sharma, sort
Yeah.
of filmed himself. This was in August. Filmed himself. It's not quite selfie, but he's doing it to camera piece, saying how great it is, how it's a really symbolic moment that he's blowing up the power station. This is the end of coal. Hurrah, 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 hurrah. And I mean, like, and the tragedy of it is, he knew then, everyone knew then, that uh, energy price rises were going through the roof. Like, I mean, you didn't know if you were just a consumer, if you were just a punter, really, maybe.
Mhm.
Except energy retail companies were folding because they hadn't hedged properly for these enormous price rises that were coming down the pipeline. So, for contracts for delivery in the future were going up. People were telling me I think in the late winter, that the prices for the next winter were going through the roof, like,
Mhm.
because there wasn't the available capacity. So yeah, this is the president of COP blowing up a coal power station while energy companies are folding. And then he goes to God. He shows no shame. I mean, even to this day, he's still saying coal is this great big enemy, as people are facing a doubling and a doubling again of their domestic energy bills. I mean, it's quite phenomenal.
Yeah.
And it means unless your family has an income of, I think, twice the median salary, after then you'll be categorized as living in energy poverty. So
Yeah.
it's going to take most of the country into this sort of category of poverty. It's a bit of a bogus category, but because you could be extremely profligate and be in energy poverty, or but nonetheless, it's going to cause some people only have a couple of thousand, or some people don't even have a couple of thousand spare a year as disposable income, right?
Right.
So
Right.
so the difference is it's about 3,000, at least £3,000 worth of difference if we don't include all of the other stuff like the driving car, the cost of petrol,
Yeah.
increased cost of food, increased costs of goods and services. Just this alone is going to just wipe a lot of people out, and we're going to see immense social harm caused by this. And so the image of the minister, the president of COP26, who's a very silly man. I mean, he's not a serious kind of person. He's he puts on this sort of but it will rub home, it will bring home to a lot of people the fact that there's something frivolous about politicians sort of posing as planet saving superheroes on the world stage while they suffer. I mean, it makes very plain the fact that green policy, climate change policy, is more dangerous than climate change.
Yeah.
So people are going to be cold.
Yeah. So heroically blowing up your own power plant, it's all fun and games until the poor people can't afford heat and to turn on their lights. But then how about if nobody can, if you flick the light switch and you don't have lights in your house? Well, what is the plan now to make sure that the hospitals still get their power in the wintertime in the UK? What is the plan? No.
Oh, there is no plan.
Yeah.
I mean, this is well, hospitals have always got diesel as long as they can get the diesel.
Okay.
They've generally speaking got backups, but they can be very energy intensive. So I don't know if they've got the full range of. I don't know if you could power a whole hospital.
Yeah.
On diesel. But maybe they'll prioritize. Sorry, go on.
Do you know if like factories and houses, individual people, do they have diesel backups? Are they thinking about some way to keep the power going?
No.
Nothing like that. No.
I guess some people have solar panels. That's something. A small number of people are going to have battery storage, but it's not like there's not quite the sort of surplus. We don't have air conditioning as standard in anything like standard in housing in Britain. And so the same sort of stands for things like power storage. I mean, I know a few people who have sort of bought little generators.
Okay.
A few hundred quid, $300, but they're not going to be able to. So can't really, these suitcase type things. You might. I don't even know if you can power a washing machine on them, but there is no plan. I think it will be cost more than rolling blackouts. I think that's going to be the thing that really hurts people. And I mean, it's feasible we come to blackouts, but they have deals with the suppliers, have deals with the large consumers, the large industrial consumers, to sort of restrict their supply. So they'll cut the factories and the businesses off first. But who knows? I mean, with the instabilities that they created, it's a bit of an open question. We're just going to have to wait and see.
Okay, but the public is going to get angry enough, don't you think, to throw out the posers and get people back in office that actually will work on reliable energy supplies and practical stuff instead of trying to prevent bad weather? I'm hoping that their sanity is going to prevail eventually.
Yeah. So, well, I hope. I don't know either, because we have got. There have been noises from the two candidates for the Tory party leadership, because we've got rid of Green Boris Johnson. So there's Rishi Sunak, and both have sort of said fracking. They don't really want. Nobody seems to really want to confront the rising cost of living crisis.
Okay.
Head on in this way. No one seems to want to confront the problem with the UK in this respect is that it has been for a long time, since Thatcher, so since 1990, which is a really long time ago now. I think that's 32 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
Politics has been done by blobs. There's
Okay.
been no democratic contest of
Mm.
policy in Britain. It's not like the States. States in the US is far more democratic in its
Mm.
makeup. And you've got, I mean, despite the sort of apparent success of some of the green agenda, even on the Republican side, there's still lots of opportunities throughout the democratic process to sort of say, you know, you've got state level, government level, you've got departments, and you've got a more active commentariat, should we say? You know, you've got more interesting and more diverse um, organizations taking part in politics, whereas everything is just aligned, seemingly completely aligned here to the green agenda. So in order to have a policy that undoes net zero, essentially, you're going to have a confrontation with a lot of the civil service,
Okay.
and a lot of these green organizations that surround both political parties, well, more than just both, most of the political parties, and a lot of government departments. There's a lot of work that gets done by green NGOs, or NGOs that are kind of sort of paragovernmental, semi-regulatory. And you've got interests embedded right in the heart of government. You know, famously, there's this was an MP, son of a multi-millionaire tycoon, Zach Goldsmith,
Okay.
who used to stand on a platform of his sort of favorite policy was allowing constituencies to recall their MPs when they got fed up with them. Anyway, he lost his seat, and he
Okay.
just got made a lord, which is our sort of feudal relic of feudalism. So
Okay.
so if you've given the Tory party £1 million, or the Labour Party for that matter, because the same thing happens, you're guaranteed a permanent job as a politician in
Okay.
the in the second chamber, right? That's how it works. I mean, since it was, I mean, it used to be a hereditary system. Well, now it's effectively just a shop. I mean, you could go and buy stuff. I mean, it's not guaranteed, but you know, famously, some very dodgy people have been elevated to the House of Lords. So anyway, you know, these the Lords is even greener than the House of Commons. It's got loads of appointments from the Green Blob in it, and where people are free to maneuver, manipulate, throw legislation back to the other house. You know, House of Commons is superior in a sense to in a literal sense. That you know, it can assert itself over the decisions of the House of Lords, but the House of Lords can make a lot of trouble for the House for legislation in the House of Commons. So, in order to start unpacking what the net zero agenda has done, there needs to be a majority of Parliament in favour of repealing it. And it's not straightforward. So you know, you'd need a qualified majority I think in both houses to amend the target, the net zero target. So it's very easy to move the target up.
Okay.
There's sort of pretty much consensus in Westminster. So you know, so when they wanted the target was originally 80% by 2050. So when they wanted to move it up to 20, they wanted to move up to net zero, which is effectively 100%. They didn't need to have a vote. They just the speaker of the House just had to hear that there were no objections.
Okay.
Right. So then like, why would you have a vote if there were no objections? So in 90 minutes, it was the discussion, not even debate. And there's this consensus is very powerful, and they've been working on it for a very long time. And it's concrete, right? There's a pledge that was signed, was instigated by a green NGO in about 2015, where the leaders of the three main parties at the time was David Cameron, Ed Miliband, and Nick Clegg for the
Okay.
Tories, Labour, and Lib Democrats. They signed this pledge saying they're going to implement the same policies, which is totally, in my view, is just an obnoxious abomination against democracy. Well, you know, we can have debates about to what extent we need a full democracy, like direct democracy or representative democracy. But this is just obnoxious to, you know, whether it's a constitutional monarchy or a constitutional republic like the US. It's just we will agree not to let the public have a say in this question. And they've got these pictures of them all smiling, signing this pledge, not that their parties aren't going to debate climate change. They're just going to do what the Green Blob has told them. So, and this consensus, cross-party consensus, has been in effect for probably 20 years. And as a consequence of that, and probably stop things like the European Union, essentially we've got a parliament of zombies that are just there to serve their blobs. And I don't want to be too dramatic about it, but there has been very little difference between the policies offered by the two main opposing sides, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. They don't represent their traditions. So the Labour Party members will say, "Oh, you don't represent the working class anymore. You know, you don't." And the Conservatives will grumble that the Conservative Party doesn't represent the tradition anymore. So you could say they should come together and agree to obliterate their own parties. That would be the best outcome, is if they both work towards demolishing their own parties and then letting whatever the true constituencies that remain, let them come forward and stand as the parties. But so it's just about power now, really, because there's no dynamic of different philosophies contesting ideas. So in a sense, the environmental issue, the climate issue, has come to the rescue of a very sclerotic, atrophied political institution that has no connection with the public anymore, right? So they want to sustain their power, but they have nothing really to sell to the public as to why they should be able to. So this emergency turns up, and so it's very much in their interest to sort of indulge in the idea of emergency, because once you've got emergency powers, you don't really need to have that conversation with the public. And I think that's the principal dynamic behind a lot of this stuff that's been growing over the last sort of 30 years. Yeah.
So don't you think, though, that public anger over high energy prices and restricted energy supplies, don't you think that at some point it's going to come to a head, and this whole net zero, they're going to push hard back against net zero, and it's going to go away? Or are they just going to take it forever? I don't know.
No. Well, I mean, you can't argue with the bottom line.
Yeah.
And the bottom line has been is a threshold that's certainly going to be crossed. I mean, it's the majority of some people's incomes. How the blob, as it were, is reorganizing itself to try and capitalize on that anger. And so one of its main arguments now is that if we'd have only had more wind farms, we wouldn't have we wouldn't have been having this crisis, which is it's arithmetically false. It just would mean we would definitely have this crisis rather than we may or may not have had this crisis, because we could have always bought more oil. So that's going to be there's a left side of that argument which is emerging, which is saying that we should put a windfall tax on the profits that the energy companies have been enjoying. Well, that will just continue the problem of underinvestment.
Yeah.
There's another one which is arguing for the nationalization of the energy sector, which if it goes ahead according to some people's wishes, would mean without compensation, which would just plunge the UK into I mean, it would just be, I mean, it's theft on any analysis. It's just
Mhm.
theft. So, would destroy Britain's financial standing. So we should compound the problems. If it wants to compensate energy companies for for what it takes from them, I'm not sure how that would be react. I think probably have a similar result, but would isn't something we could afford either. So there's a lot of spite behind those campaigns and a lot of ideological movements behind those campaigns, and we'll see how successful they are in mobilizing public opinion. If it goes anything like it's going in Holland, then maybe we'll see a sharper U-turn. But I don't think there's the mental equipment in Westminster to recognize that it's a problem with net zero,
Yeah.
even if there are people tearing up the streets and rioting. Um, so I don't know. We're pretty much snookered, I think. So the emphasis, the responsibility really is on us to make the arguments that this is the consequence of green policy, which is why I find Joe Biden's inflation reduction policy quite remarkable.
Yes,
It's like it seems destined to create more
absolutely.
uh,
Yeah.
inflation.
There was just this interview in the last week or two that I've mentioned elsewhere. It's Michael Yon being interviewed by Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you happen to see that one. That made a huge impression on me because Michael Yon made a strong case that in places around the world in the next year or two, we're going to see serious starvation. That this whole idea of choking off the food and energy supplies, it's all fun and games for the richer countries, but for the people living right on the edge, they're actually going to face uh, literal starvation, and there's going to be rioting in the streets, and things are going to really come to a head around the world, he thinks, in the next year or two. I don't know if you have any ideas on that, but he made a good case for that.
I think I haven't seen an interview. I'll look out
Yeah.
for that. But
Yeah.
well, I think we've seen that certainly in the developing economies in Sri Lanka,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
Matt Ridley points out had a 98% ESG score,
Yes. Yep.
which is probably quite high. Right? Flattering Western indulgences, but just completely ignoring the interests of the public. And I think this just cements the idea for me. And I think, and this is why I don't think you need to argue about whether CO2 is a greenhouse gas that's causing climate change
Mhm.
or catastrophic climate change. It's that climate change policy is worse for us than climate change.
Absolutely.
It's just
Absolutely.
like, you could face a tenfold increase in the number of storms,
Mhm.
a tenfold increase in the number of hot heat waves. Oh no, heat waves! I mean, we're having one at the moment, and it's beautiful. And people aren't dying. They're over here on the beach. There's a couple of thousand people not dying on the beach. Anyway, I'm making light of a very serious point. So and these figures would not, the number of people who suffer from increased extreme weather would barely even register
Mhm.
in global terms. And the number of people who experience problems from extreme weather anyway has diminished. We've seen this on lots of, because we all know this now. This is what's been established. It's fallen something like 98%, 99% over the course of a century, despite a tripling or maybe a quadrupling of the global population. There is no signal of in the amount of people. There's no climate change signal in the amount of people who live in poverty. I don't need to rehearse all this stuff with you because we know it all. You could increase the impacts of climate change 100 times, and we'd
Yes.
still be better off.
Yes. Yep.
And yet that orthodoxy that we are somehow dependent on nature persists, even as those policies create havoc throughout the world. And you know, that and in the final analysis, I worried that, you know, this could be quite easily a more fatal conceit, as it were, than World War II, you know, which took the lives of 50 million people or so.
Yes.
That's that would be the nature of depriving. That would be the consequences of depriving so many people of cheap energy. You
Yeah.
just leave them to nature. Nature is not benevolent. She's not like some billionaire. But this is what green ideology teaches people, or makes people. I mean, a lot of people, often very comfortable people, as you point out.
Yes.
You know, they're often very posh, as we would say here in Britain. They're people who've never really struggled for money, and you know, or property, who get this idea that wealth is created by natural providence, you know, like a secular divine providence that you just sort of ask and you shall receive. You just have to sort of be nice. You have to live in harmony with nature. That's just not true at all. You know, we survive despite nature because we cooperate, and the main, you know, whether that's the market or some other means of cooperation. But this idea that we cooperate and we produce value through our efforts, it's like apostasy to a religious
It is.
movement. It's just it is there's it's very difficult to rationalize with these folks. You know,
Yeah.
they're,
Oh, did you see the cost and benefit analysis by Bjorn Lomborg of the Inflation Reduction Act? I think the cost to prevent bad weather, $369 billion, and the benefit was like 0.028 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. That's supposed to be a benefit, like a cooler world by something you can't measure. That's the benefit. And that's the
right.
best way to spend that much money, to choke off reliable power supplies and spend that much money for no measurable benefit at all. I think that that's a good point that ordinary people can understand easily. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. It needs figures like that to say it. But what it
Yeah.
doesn't have, of course, is there's no big money behind Bjorn Lomborg, and there's no political movement you know, that's established that needs those kind of analysis. And what there are, unfortunately, is a lot of organizations that will smear
Yeah.
Bjorn
Yep.
Lomborg, as they do routinely. They'll sort of harass him legally through you know, various things to try and exclude him from platforms. And those are becoming a bigger thing. So I think that's something to watch out for. That a very defensive green movement is going to be a lot more interventionist in the future. And I think they're readying themselves to get us all kicked off Twitter and social media, and
Yeah.
use financial regulation to harass people.
Yeah. I think it's a good point that when in the history of mankind have the people doing the censoring, have they been on the right side of history? Right. They're
Right.
trying to censor us. When has that ever been the right side of history? Yeah. So
Yeah.
hopefully we can stay on Twitter.
Yeah, so what I'm really trying to argue now, is that we've got a lot of opportunity to now that people's attention is on the importance of energy to our economy and our well-being. We've got a lot of opportunity to start exploring the whole of the debate, the whole, not just the sort of some of the technical points. So I think that if you look at this sort of diagram of where I think we're at, the the we've a lot of skepticism has been focused very much on the very left of this diagram, so on the thermal properties of CO2, and whether or not that causes global warming and to what extent. Now, a lot of global warming is predicated on feedbacks or positive feedbacks. So this is where the models get it perhaps too warm. And you know, there was relatively little controversy about whether CO2 is a greenhouse gas. You know, the controversy enters the debate on the role of feedbacks, which and this is kind of underexplored. And this error, I'm arguing, cascades through the green chain of reasoning. So in there, we've got something like a periodic table of elements of the climate debate. I've put them into columns. So there's the first order effects of global warming, such as sea ice loss. And we've got second order effects of warming, which is sort of like the effects of the effects. And then in the yellow column, we've got what you call, well, the nth order effects. That's sort of the climate crisis. And then you've got the policy response. Now, and between all of these things is typically modeling. So a lot of studies that predict, for example, radical ecosystems losses depending on dramatic predictions and projections of global warming. So, for example, there's an undue emphasis on RCP 8.5 scenarios before the recent AR6 has changed those slightly. So you get worst case scenarios being presented as fact to the next column. And so this sort of error amplifies as well as cascades. But people have been put off the climate debate because they don't want to. They're probably kind of dissuaded from a discussion about the thermal properties of CO2 and global feedbacks. But there are all these other opportunities to challenge, because you don't have to be a climate change denier to recognize that claims about sea ice loss, in the Arctic, have been exaggerated, right? And that's a problem for this chain of reasoning. And ditto with heat waves. We've seen a lot of panic about heat waves, and it's true that 2003 heat wave saw quite a lot of excess deaths throughout Europe, but that was a policy problem. That was because people were left, often very vulnerable people, were left to suffer. And it's a problem. Heat waves are very much a problem like COVID was, that it affects people towards the very last weeks of their life. And so typically, if you've had a winter without many flu deaths, if there's a heat wave in the summer, you tend to get an increased number of mortalities associated with that. So and it raises the same questions about the appropriateness of the policies intended to mitigate it. And the facts, and they've been pointed out to death, obviously, by people like Lomborg, is that cold still claims, even in a country like the UK, which is very relatively wealthy, not for much longer, cold claims 80 times as many lives as heat. And you'd have to, in order to, to make those equal, you'd have to make it really hot, to start killing as many people with heat as you killed by cold. Sorry, cold. you'd have to make a lot of climate change to make heat as much problem as cold. And we can see that there haven't been an increased number and intensity of storms. This famously, we're in a hurricane drought.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe we can concede a bit of increased precipitation, and then moving over to the second column, that hasn't turned into floods, according to the IPCC. The IPCC attach a low level of confidence to trends that link flooding to climate change. And again, flooding is a policy question. Floods happen where people don't maintain water management infrastructure, and famously in the case of Katrina in New Orleans, that was a policy failure. That was engineering failure caused by policy failure to maintain levees. And in the UK too, a lot of our sort of infrastructure that manages quite large water catchment areas was built a long time ago, and was sort of co-developed with transport infrastructure of the time, canals essentially. So a lot of the waterways that were constructed in the 18th or earlier centuries aren't maintained in the same way, so they can't carry as much water along. And so these are, the Greens have an answer to questions like that, but that's not the end of the discussion. There is a very strong debate that argument to be had in a debate that maintenance will solve these problems, but that doesn't happen. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I just have a couple of tiny points to make here. Just on that sea ice loss, I think one assumption that when ice melts, that's a loss. Like if a glacier melts, that's a loss. I would dispute even that part, because what is now Chicago in the U.S. had thousands of feet of ice on top of it not that long ago geologically, and then it melted. And was that a loss? I think that was a gain. So
that's right.
Ice is not necessarily good. Then one other tiny point is that I think possibly CO2 might cause a little extra precipitation, but it is never credited with preventing a drought or making the crops grow a little better when it would have been drier, or maybe prevents fires a little bit. They never, ever make that argument. It's always only if you didn't want it to rain, that's when it causes it to rain more. And same deal where it causes drought. Maybe it causes less rain someplace, but it never lessens a flood. It only causes a decreased rain when that's bad. So it only does bad things. Anyway.
That's right. And your point speaks exactly to that fact, to that green ideological myth that there is a right amount of ice. There's a right amount of rain. There's a rightful balance of rain and not rain, and that we've disturbed it, and that we cannot absorb the change in that thing, because again, the idea is that farmers are just these sort of like automata who walk into the field based on their centuries of programming and do what they've always done, and so there's no adaptive capacity in just normal agricultural workers' minds, which is completely bonkers. Farmers are very adept at managing quite radically different climates year to year, or weather year to year. I mean, it might go, their abilities might sort of suffer a bit more or less, but that they learn, right? They're not what the way a lot of these policymakers treat ordinary people who from farmers to homeowners even is as though as non-functioning or non-thinking entities. That it's like that people, and this speaks maybe more to the third column. These claims, this is the climate emergency column, right? And there's just no data whatsoever to support the claim that there is a climate emergency. Absolutely none. All of the evidence contradicts it. There's less poverty, there's less conflict in measured by deaths. I mean, we've got some horrible conflicts going on in the world that could give rise to the end of humanity, but it has nothing to do with climate change. And again, with agricultural productivity, we see year after year, even in sort of the poorer economies, that there's more being produced with less land. Globally, the amount of land we use for agricultural production peaked, and now we use less. It's there was an overabundance of agricultural land, causing problems. And so all of these claims, if you're watching this and you don't feel confident about taking part in discussions about global warming as such, the physics, this is the basic physics, and you're worried that people are going to tell you that you're a basic physics denier, go for the yellow column.
Okay.
Make your arguments there. Go and find the data on infectious diseases. It's very easy to find. All of them that are linked to climate, with the exception of, I think, is it the Zika virus, which showed this very small increase in the data. Malaria was in precipitous decline. I think it may go up again, but that would be because of the poverty that's being caused by the expensive energy, thanks to the thanks to the Greens. So just start in the yellow column, and then work your way to the red column, because this is where it's just completely nuts. That emissions reduction targets have been created with no idea about how to implement. So, it's fine. If they'd have said, we're going to reduce CO2 emissions by 80% by doing this, but I think Roger Pilker puts it as putting the policy, the cart is the cart before the horse. The technology cart before the policy horse, right? Or I probably jumbled that up. You make sense of it. If they said, we're gonna reduce all the emissions from the power sector at the rate that we can afford it, and it is technically feasible by using nuclear power, and then we're going, or we're going to decarbonize transport at the rate that it's technologically and economically feasible by switching to batteries and to EVs, then it would have been harder to object to it. But they say, but they enshrine the emissions reduction targets in law. And they say, oh, it's going to be this wonderful new economy. It's going to create green jobs. It's a green industrial revolution. Why are you complaining? This is great. But actually, it turns out only the targets are legally enforceable, and they do enforce them through the courts. These very well-funded green organizations, especially in the Netherlands recently, have been taking governments to courts because they haven't been able to implement their emissions reduction targets. They haven't sort of backed them up with policy, because there is no policy that can't cause absolute chaos, as we're seeing now. There's no like for like replacement for these things. So all of the upsides that were promised in return for emissions reduction targets are just gone to the wind. They don't exist. But the green blob keeps hammering them home, and he attempts to sort of implement emissions reduction policies through things like emission trading and consumer rationing, have just created this hardship, which we've talked about. And so their recourse is to stuff like behavior change, which is a complete departure from democratic norms, which require our consent for in order to implement them, to impose these kind of policies that sort of seek to elicit from you your obedience. They don't ask for your assent. They don't ask for you to vote in support of these policies. So it's a total transformation of the relationship between the individual and government, or society, the public and government, in which it's an elitist form of politics. So you might not be comfortable arguing about how CO2 works, but you damn well have a right to argue that you should be asked for your assent to these policies, and you should be they should not be able to act without that assent, and you should be free to dissent from those policies. You should be free to speak. But as we've seen, as we discussed, we're being increasingly, the public sphere is increasingly closed off to skeptics. You won't get a climate skeptic on the BBC. We wouldn't be having this discussion on any of the major broadcasters in the UK. I think maybe elsewhere is a bit more relaxed about that sort of thing. But they make no mistake, the green blob is spending a lot of money. Green organizations spending huge amounts of money trying to lump in critics of climate change policy with vaccine deniers and terrorists. I have some sympathy with vaccine deniers. I think people should be free to have these views. I didn't have the jab. And I think these decisions should be for the individual to make, but they're trying to lump these kind of arguments in with jihadi terrorism. I mean, literally,
Right.
kind of the legislation that's been advanced in Canada, in the European Union, and in the UK, and I think there's a version in the US, because you had that brouhaha with that. What was her? She was going to be the minister for misinformation or something.
Oh yeah, yes.
Recently.
Yep, I do remember that. Yep, that went
Yeah.
away though.
So and right, well, because she was just such an embarrassing figure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's no less embarrassing in the UK, but the intention is there to regulate the debate, to stop these information, the sort of information being discussed, and we've discussed the financial regulation part of the policy response, the red column too. So there's a lot that you can focus on if you're just not happy with the climate agenda, with the climate science, and I would suggest people find that level that they're interested in, and direct their research and their comments to that, rather than sort of overextend themselves in a way with the scientific arguments.
Yeah, I think this is great. And I think it's a good point that if you're just starting fresh on the argument and you find out that they're lying to us about CO2 induced poverty, which they are, or lying to us about reduced crop yields, then you got to wonder what else are they lying to you about? And the answer is just about everything.
Everything.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty common path to skepticism where people do believe it generally, but then as soon as they start digging into any specifics, they find out that the whole thing is a house of cards. That is kind of my path as well. I've heard a lot of skeptics say that once they looked at the data for themselves in some area, then they realized that there were lots of lies out there. So,
yeah, well, I mean, it comes back to your experience with the what triggered your skepticism, and it just takes that one
yes,
one moment, that thing. This is a very jarring inversion of what my expectations were up to this point. I thought it was all like this, and then now there's this inversion. I don't, and it reveals a lot about the nature of politics today. Like you should take a lot for granted, or what? Sorry, one can take a lot for granted about the way government works, and how it makes its decisions, and on what and in whose interests. And with this being a flagship agenda for much of the West,
hmm
it does open one's eyes to the fact that it really is something of a mediocrity,
yes,
and
yeah.
that there isn't much celebration or reward for, or celebration of, or reward for independent thinking. I mean, it seems designed to punish independence of thought, and
Mhm.
a lot of the civil servants, the activists involved in this, they don't display much understanding or knowledge of their subject. The think tanks, the organizations,
Mhm.
just seem to be sort of organized around merely aligning public institutions,
Mhm.
not a discovery of the facts, or truth. It's just power. It's quite unsettling. Go on. Sorry.
We touched on this on our Twitter space yesterday. We talked a little bit about this, and there was some discussion about how people who are all in on the climate scam, there's nothing we can say about the data that are going to change their mind. Like Michael Mann has gone, he's pushed all his chips in. There's no way we're going to show him hurricane data and he's not going to change his mind. But I do think there's tons of people like I was in the past who sort of believed it, but had never really thought about it. I think still to this day, there's lots and lots of those people. And I think those are the people that we could easily reach by just showing them some data, and we can flip people over to the side of sanity. So I think there's great opportunity here, and that's one reason why I push back as hard as I do all the time.
Yeah.
Because you can reach
Yeah.
a lot of sane people. Yep.
You do a great job of it. I love watching the feeds unfold, and your climate brawl and stuff. And that's the point. I think you're right in like the arguing with Michael Mann is probably the second most pointless thing one can do when one's like. I mean, You can take Mike Mann's words and interpret them, I think, but you're never going to get a good faith debate out of these new narcissistic scientists. It's a very much personal project for them. It doesn't really matter what the consequences are to this generation of climate scientists who sort of who have abandoned the scientific method in a sense. And I don't just mean that in the sort of it's a no. It's a transformation of institutional science. Whereas that sort of used to make possible in scientific institutions used to make possible some level of cooperation and collaboration in which ideas were tested. You know, you might have a team A and a team B, or what have you. Now science seems to be just about servicing the political agenda from climate, COVID, and other similar issues. Science is this sort of taking the place of the philosophical arguments that used to happen in democratic politics, and all of this sort of principles and of political agenda seems to be taken for granted. We've got to reduce the risks. We've got to reduce, we've got to make people safe. We've got to change the planet. We've got to change. People have to live in this way, and the contestation of those principles sort of gets swept aside by these claims that science, follow the science, famously said someone who hasn't even finished primary education, never mind completed a secondary or gone to university. She just took it at face value, and that power that's been cemented in scientific institutions isn't going to dilute itself. It's just going to recruit people like Michael Mann. It's just going to create people like Michael Mann. That's how it's sort of, that's the way the ideology is transmitted from the institution to the individual. Celebrates people who are much more keen on orthodoxy than on truth. Well,
Yeah.
Michael Mann. So I think we've got to speak to the middle ground and people who are going to ask questions about why energy prices are so high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Twitter is still a good place for people who haven't been banned yet to argue this stuff and just say what you really think and put up your data against their data and debate it. I think that is the way to get to the truth. And I'm glad that at least some of that is still going on Twitter. I do think that there was some idea of having a red team, blue team. I don't know if that's what they called it under Trump. They're going to sort of have a formal team, I think, that would scientifically come up with what they thought about the climate debate versus what the consensus was. I don't know if you heard anything about that. There was some rumblings about doing that. I think that would be fantastic if that actually happened at some point.
That happened in should I stop sharing this? Stop sharing. Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
That happened in the Netherlands. There was a guy, Theo, I forget his name. It was just Marcel
Kroc,
I think.
I know that name. Yeah.
And he set up a red team, blue team thing with in cooperation with the Netherlands government. I think it was very successful up to the extent that it was allowed, and there was a good faith discussion going on. I think he's written up a lot of what he found and what happened and and the responses. But obviously the Netherlands government has sort of dispensed with that as a way of formulating policy or having debates policy that's sort of gone full green, largely because it's been forced to by through climate lawfare, which is why people must listen to what Chris Horner is saying, because it's coming to a farm near you,
absolutely,
supermarket, and it's going to change your life. But I think people were talking about red team, blue team in the States as well. Yeah, maybe it's a way of softening the blow to, we say, okay, you don't want to take our word for it because we're a bunch of climate change deniers, but why don't you just throw the debate open on or to if you're not gonna have a democratic reply, let's have a debate between people of different perspectives. Arguing on these range topics. Maybe it's an easier sell than just reversing climate policy. I did send an email to, I don't know if you remember at the beginning of the Boris Johnson administration.
I don't remember that.
There was a guy called Dominic Cummings who was sort of the policy genius allegedly behind Brexit and behind he was involved in the Johnson government the other day. He fell out with Carrie Simmons, who's Johnson's partner, who's this activist.
Okay.
This is why we are where we are. And why why he is where he is. But I did send him an email because he said he sort of put out this call for ideas. I said you need a red team, blue team, but obviously just took no notice of that. But so it went straight in the bin. But they know that, and I think the GWPF have been sort of suggesting that there should be red team, blue team stuff to combat the groupthink. Christopher Booker did a really good report for the GWPF before he died a few years ago. And that was about groupthink. And I think that was, he suggested in that that may have been a solution, just to start breaking up that thing. But I think maybe it takes for granted, or maybe it doesn't take enough account of the power of money in policymaking. Maybe it's sort of naive to expect a good faith debate to take place. Maybe it's got to have some level of produce some kind of crisis before that there is the sort of pressure to examine the causes of that crisis.
Okay. I do think in 2022, the whole idea that the only way to have a scientific debate is to submit a formal paper and try to get it through referees and all that stuff, and then wait 6 months for the response. I think that is ridiculous nowadays. I like it a lot better if you put the stuff on the internet and people can respond in real time. I think that makes a lot more sense. But I'm not saying,
well, I mean, if you do put it on the, if you do get it published, which I mean, if you're not affiliated to an institution, an academic publisher is just not interested, right? And then even if you did get it published, they would just face such an onslaught of complaints from the campaigners that they would get retracted. Although I did see that Nature, I think it was Nature or Science, has just retracted it. So does that Science have just retracted its 2014 paper, which argued that acidification changed the behavior of fish.
Yeah.
And this is interesting, partly because it's just another story from the ocean acidification field, which is debunked. And it's interesting because it coincides, this retraction of the paper coincides with this historic recovery that the Great Barrier Reef in Australia is enjoying at the moment. So that's two major stories that get routinely. The Great Barrier Reef is Australia's polar bear, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's got lots of charismatic creatures and stuff, but it's one of their main things, and that turns out to be bunk as well. It's starting to be, maybe even institutional science can't keep this up, but this if it turns out that there's a lot of coral reef, and it turns out that ocean acidification doesn't affect the seas in this way, then there's an explanation is required, right? Well, how come some researchers were so angry when we suggested it? Suggested that coral reefs might not be endangered, when polar bears might not be endangered, and fish might not be. Why were you so cross? Why wouldn't you just let people? You write your paper, this guy writes his paper. Why were you so keen on? And this is I think important, because we've got, it's not enough to say, well, it's okay, the process was corrected by science. No, you attempted to stop the scientific process making these discoveries. You didn't let this researcher publish her work. I'm thinking of Susan Crockford, who people were extremely angry about. because she dared to publish articles saying that polar bears were doing fine. So this is what needs to be explained: is how scientific how institutional science has become colonized by very nasty, spiteful politics.
Absolutely.
So, never mind is CO2 a greenhouse gas. It's why do scientists behave in this way? Why does institutional science not foster collegiate kind of scientific investigation? They don't have to be best mates. They
Right,
just
right.
have to They just have to be able to be free to disagree. And the job of the institution is to say, here is the campus on which you can freely explore your ideas. It's like, no, now you must, if you're a member of the campus, you must have the right ideas before you
Absolutely.
research them.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm pleased that you brought up Susan Crockford. I don't know if I mentioned to you, but I'm interviewing her on this podcast tomorrow.
Oh, good.
So
She's
yeah,
great.
I'm excited to talk to her about polar bears because I think she brings a lot of sanity to that part of the debate. So yeah,
Yeah, she does it very, very casually,
yeah,
very easily. And, like,
yes,
she does it. She's great. I mean,
yep.
I hope she hasn't been too badly damaged by the attacks on her, but at home, Peter Ridd, there's
Oh yeah,
really nasty people that attack them that just, for no good end. Like,
yeah.
she really annoyed them. But
I think Peter Ridd got a lot of career damage for telling the truth, right? From what I know, that he was telling the truth. It was inconvenient for Warmus, and I think there was enormous amounts of attack on him because of that.
yeah, and the use of the legal. I mean, I think he tried to defend himself legally, which is perfectly fine. But yeah,
Yeah,
to get people thrown out of their jobs, not at the beginning of their career as well, to take so much away from them and to accuse them of so much and to damage people. It's clearly not about science. It's clearly
yes, yeah,
a much deeper, nastier, insidious thing that's happening. Whether we're right or they're right, it's got this other form. It's got this other dimension. It's not about truth and how we decide you know, how we determine what the truth is, how we discover what the truth is, and make judgments. It's a regression to something more akin to the Dark Ages or worse. It's kind of using research and institutions to manipulate people's understanding. So
yeah. I completely agree. So I think we're getting towards the end of our time here today. Do you have more points you'd like to make? Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up here pretty soon. And
that's good.
go.
We can.
Okay. Do you have any advice on where people can reach you, or you have a YouTube channel? And I can put this in the show notes, your YouTube channel and climate resistance and your Twitter handle. I can find that. Yes.
I'm currently in Twitter prison.
Yes.
Which is unpleasant place to be. Someone who's so habituated to Twitter.
Yeah.
And, so I don't know whether I'm coming back. I don't know whether they'll let me, but I have an appeal. But
Okay.
but we'll see. But look out for that. Look out for Blog. I think if I'm not on Twitter, and I'm going to be setting up a new thing in the autumn, hopefully, to sort of bring some of the ideas I've been talking about, the structure of the debate, into, hopefully to sort of start bringing debate back to the political process and to not letting, because people should be allowed, putting debate back at the center of things, because the point is not that we're right and they're wrong. The point is about how we discover which arguments are better than the others. So we need to demand a bit more debate rather than this sort of orthodoxy we've been discussing.
Fantastic. All right. We'll look forward to that. Thank you very much. And we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, Tom. Great to be. Cheers. Bye.